The knock came just as the first light broke the rim of the horizon, a sound too timid to belong to men and too insistent to be the wind. Chris Boone had been awake since before dawn, as he always was, stoking the hearth with the kind of care that comes only to a man who has spent too many years alone with silence. The crackle of fire against pine kindling was steady, a companion more faithful than human voices. He was rolling his sleeves past his elbows, calloused hands blackened with soot, when he heard it again. 3 sharp taps on the heavy cedar door, each one lighter than the last, as if the knocker feared the door might bite back. He did not rise at once. Men in these parts knew better than to arrive unannounced at his ranch, especially in early winter when tempers froze as easily as creek water. His land sat on the edge of pine forest, a mile from the town road, with no neighbors close enough to stumble by accident. Whoever it was had come with purpose. Chris straightened, shoulders brushing the rough lintel above the hearth, and waited for the sound to come again. When it did, soft as bones tapping a coffin lid, he crossed the cabin in long strides and unlatched the bar. On the stoop stood 2 girls, hair tangled, cheeks pale as the frost that rimmed the world. One was perhaps 10, the other no more than 8. They wore cotton dresses patched and thinned, their shawls too ragged to keep out the morning bite. Their boots were scuffed, toes damp, laces knotted like desperate prayers. The elder held the younger's hand with the firmness of one who had learned too soon that life tears away anything not gripped tight. Their eyes, wide and solemn, were the only bright thing about them, though even those eyes were rimmed in sleepless red. The younger's lips quivered when she spoke, her voice a whisper that clung to the air as if afraid of being stolen. "Sir, our mama, she's dying. They've got her in chains. In the cabin down the ridge. Please, please help." Chris had seen many kinds of pleading. Men begging for their lives in saloons, women bargaining with landlords for another week before eviction, children clutching a crust of bread as if it were heaven itself. Yet something in the cadence of that whisper, its steadiness beneath the tremor, touched a place in him long hardened. He had buried his wife 4 winters past, and the silence of her absence had taught him the weight of voices that refused to fade. He looked at the girls a long moment, letting the words settle into the timber of the doorway. "Chains," he repeated, voice low, almost as if testing the sound against the morning stillness. The elder girl nodded, a jerky motion born of fear and defiance. Her name, she said, was Ellen, and her sister was Ruth. "Mama's hurt bad. She won't last much longer. The man won't let us see her unless we bring food. But we ain't got nothing left." Behind them, the land stretched in pale hues, grass brittle with frost, sky streaked with copper and rose, pines rising like a dark wall. Chris's horse stamped in the corral, breath steaming in the crisp air, as if sensing the urgency that pressed against the cabin door. Chris did not speak at once. He let his eyes rest on their thin arms, the way Ellen's jaw trembled though she held it steady, the way Ruth pressed closer to her sister as though any wind might scatter her to pieces. They had walked far. That much was plain. Inside him stirred a resistance old as his grief. He had sworn not to be drawn again into the troubles of strangers. A man who lived alone was a man unbroken by disappointment. Yet the fire behind those pleading eyes worked against that vow. He thought of his wife, gone beneath the frozen earth, and how she had once spoken of children they never had. He thought of the winters since, each one colder than the last though the fire burned hot. Chris unlatched the door fully and stepped aside. The girls entered, hesitant, as if the warmth might swallow them whole. The cabin smelled of smoke, iron, and the faint sweetness of cornmeal bread cooling on the hearthstone. Ellen guided Ruth to the bench by the fire, brushing snowflakes from her sister's hair with the care of a mother too young. Chris poured water into a tin cup and set it before them without words. Ruth drank in greedy gulps, water running down her chin. Ellen sipped more slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "Tell me," Chris said, voice measured, "about these chains." Ellen swallowed hard. She spoke of Silas Crane, a man who had claimed debts after their father's death, saying their mother owed him land and labor. When she could not pay, he came with iron shackles and locked her inside her own cabin, feeding her scraps, forbidding her daughters to visit unless they brought something in trade. He laughed when they begged. Said no one would help poor settler girls. Said folks would rather look away. The words came halting, but each one struck like a hammer. Chris listened without interruption, his jaw tight. He had known Silas in passing, enough to see the cruelty behind the man's smile. A land baron in a town too weak to oppose him, Silas bought favors with whiskey and threats. Chris had stayed clear of his dealings. But this, chains on a woman, children turned into beggars at dawn, this was a rot that spread if left to fester. When Ellen finished, silence pooled heavy. The only sound was the fire's murmur and the faint shiver of Ruth's teeth. Chris stood, his height filling the cabin, and pulled on his coat of rough brown wool. He reached for the rifle resting by the door, slung it across his back, then knelt before the girls. His eyes, the gray of weathered steel, met theirs. "You'll ride with me. Show me the cabin." Ellen's shoulders eased, though her hand never let go of Ruth's. For the first time since they arrived, hope flickered across her face, fragile as a candle flame. Ruth whispered thank you, so faint Chris almost mistook it for the wind. He saddled his mare, a strong bay with a white blaze, and lifted the girls one by one into the worn leather seat. Ellen clung tight, Ruth pressed against her, their small figures bundled beneath his heavy wool blanket. Chris swung up behind them, the horse shifting beneath the sudden weight, and steered toward the ridge. The land rolled out in muted colors, brown grass brittle beneath hooves, frost clinging to fence posts, the sky paling to silver. Pines stood solemn along the ridgeline, their needles whispering in the wind. The girls sat silent, the rhythm of hooves their only comfort. Chris felt their tremors through the blanket, felt their trust pressed against his chest. He did not speak. Words had less strength than silence in moments like this. As they rode, memory seeped through him. His wife's laughter once carried in this same wind. He had buried her young, before she bore him children, and the house had become an echo. He had chosen solitude rather than risk the ache of losing again. Yet here he was, with 2 children clinging to him as if he were anchor and world. The irony was not lost on him. Life had a way of circling back, setting fire where ash still smoldered. The ridge grew steeper. Smoke rose faintly ahead, thin and gray, curling from a chimney half collapsed. The cabin appeared through the trees, weather-beaten, its logs rotted at the base, shutters nailed shut. The sight tightened something in Chris's chest. This was no home. It was a prison crouched among pines. He slowed the mare and let the girls slide down, their boots sinking in frosted earth. He dismounted, rifle loose in his hand, eyes fixed on the door. The girls clutched his coat, their breaths quick. Inside, silence hung too heavy, as though even despair had stilled. Chris approached, every sense sharp. The wood of the cabin was scarred with old axe marks, the latch rusted, but from within came the faint sound of chains dragging across floorboards. He rested his hand on the door. The girl's eyes were wide, fear and hope tangled together. Chris drew a slow breath, the kind a man takes when stepping across a line he knows will change everything. Then he pushed the door open. The stench of mildew and smoke struck first. In the dim light, through slats where morning crept, he saw her, Martha Hale, the mother. She sat slumped against a post, wrists shackled by iron links, hair tangled across her bruised face. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of the door, dazed, hollow, yet still burning with a dignity chains could not erase. The girls cried out, running to her, falling to their knees at her side. Martha's weak hands reached for them, trembling as if even touch were a miracle. Chris stood in the doorway, shadow cast long across the ruined floor. His jaw clenched, eyes hard as winter stone. The sight before him carved a vow into the marrow of his bones. This was no longer another man's trouble. This was a reckoning waiting in silence. And somewhere in that silence, from deeper within the cabin, a voice drawled low and cruel. "You got no business here, Boone." Chris did not flinch at the voice that slithered from the shadows. It was rough, half amusement and half threat, the kind of tone that belonged to a man who believed his cruelty had become law. His hand stayed on the rifle, though he did not yet raise it. The 2 girls clung to their mother, their thin arms wrapped around her waist, as if they feared she might vanish if they let go. Martha Hale lifted her head slowly, eyes glassy with fever and weakness, but even through the haze there was recognition. She knew the man at the door. A glimmer of both hope and dread passed across her face, a strange mixture that told Chris she was not certain which of those emotions could be trusted. Silas Crane stepped from the corner where the shadows had kept him. He was broad, thick in the belly but strong in the arms, with a face that wore smugness like a badge. His boots clanged against the boards as he came forward, spurs striking with every step. His coat was of black wool, too fine for honest labor, and his hat sat low on his forehead, hiding eyes that had never known mercy. He carried no weapon in hand, but the smirk on his lips was sharper than steel. Behind him, 2 hired men leaned against the far wall, each with revolvers hanging idle but ready, their expressions flat as stone. Chris's voice was calm, yet carried the weight of iron. "You chained her in her own cabin." Silas chuckled, as though the question were a child's folly. "A man has debts, Boone. Debts don't vanish when he dies. She belongs here till I say different. And who are you to say otherwise? Some hermit hiding in the woods with his ghosts? These girls should be grateful I've let their mama live at all." Martha flinched at the words, but she did not lower her eyes. Though her wrists were raw and her body frail, some ember of pride burned steady in her gaze. Chris saw it, and it steadied him. He stepped further into the room, the firelight from the hearth casting his broad frame into stark relief. The hired men shifted, hands twitching near their holsters, but Silas raised one hand lazily, as though amused to let the moment play longer. Chris ignored them, his eyes fixed on the chains, rust biting into pale skin. He lowered his rifle from his shoulder and set it gently against the doorframe, a gesture of peace that carried its own warning. Then, with one motion, he pulled from his belt a short iron tool, heavy and scarred with use. He crouched before Martha, the iron biting cold in his hand, and slipped it into the shackle's lock. The girls held their breath, pressing close to their mother's side. With a sharp twist and a grunt, the metal gave way. The first chain clattered to the floorboards like a snake cut in two. Silas's smile faltered. "Careful now, Boone. That woman is mine by law. Break those chains and you'll answer for it." Chris said nothing. The second shackle fell, and Martha's arms, though trembling, were free at last. She lifted them slowly, as if unsure whether her own body belonged to her any more. The girls wept into her lap, pressing kisses into her torn dress, whispering "Mama" over and over. Martha drew them close, her weak hands moving through their hair with the gentleness of a woman who had feared she might never touch them again. Chris rose. His eyes met Silas's, steel against stone. "She goes with me." The room thickened with tension. Silas stepped closer, boots striking heavy, until he stood a mere arm's length away. His voice dropped low, a growl wrapped in mockery. "You think you can walk into my place, Boone, take what's mine, and ride off? You've lived too long in your solitude. The world don't bend to men like you anymore. It bends to those who aren't afraid to break it." Chris did not move, but the fire in his gaze did not waver. He spoke so quietly that the girls almost missed it. "Some things ain't meant to bend." A silence deeper than gunfire stretched. The hired men shifted again, but Silas did not signal them. He studied Chris with the kind of curiosity one reserves for a wild animal that has not yet decided to bite. Finally, with a smirk sharp enough to draw blood, he stepped back. "Take her. Take the brats. You'll find the world less kind once you've carried their burden." He spat into the dirt near the hearth, the sound wet and cruel. "She'll crawl back to me when hunger gnaws her bones again." Martha closed her eyes, shame pressing across her face like a shadow. Chris saw it, the weight of those words sinking into her, and it stirred something fierce within him. He reached down and lifted her gently to her feet. She staggered, her legs weak, but he steadied her with a hand firm and sure. For the first time in months, she stood unchained, her daughters clinging to either side. The firelight painted her bruises stark, but beneath them, Chris saw the contours of a woman not broken but surviving. They stepped into the morning air together, the cold biting their cheeks. Behind them, Silas's laughter trailed like smoke, a sound that promised future reckoning. Chris helped Martha onto his mare, the girls climbing up beside her, their small bodies pressed close for warmth. He took the reins, walking beside the horse rather than riding, his tall figure steady against the wind. The forest seemed to bow as they passed, the pines whispering secrets of freedom hard won. Martha did not speak at first. Her head leaned against Ellen's shoulder, eyes half shut. But when the cabin was no longer visible, she opened them, her voice rasping with both pain and disbelief. Why? Why would you, a man like you, trouble yourself with a woman already ruined? Chris's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes on the path, the frost crunching beneath his boots. You're not ruined, he said simply. You endured. That's worth more than any land Silas thinks he owns. Her breath caught, a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. She pressed her lips to her daughter's hair, as though anchoring herself in their existence. For the first time in months, the chains were not the heaviest thing she carried. By the time they reached Chris's ranch, the sun had risen higher, spilling pale light across the valley. Smoke lifted from the chimney as if welcoming them home. Chris lifted Martha carefully from the saddle, his arms steady as oak. She wavered on her feet, but he guided her inside, seating her near the fire's warmth. The girls spread blankets over her legs, their small hands working with fierce urgency. Chris brought water, bread, and the last of his dried venison, setting it quietly before them. He did not ask for thanks. He did not need it. As Martha ate in slow, trembling bites, her eyes darted often to Chris, searching, questioning. She had lived too long under cruelty to trust kindness without suspicion. Yet each time he passed, stoking the fire, stacking wood, refilling cups, his silence carried no judgment, only steadiness. It unnerved her, and it soothed her all at once. When the girls had finally fallen asleep on the rug before the hearth, Martha spoke again, her voice low so as not to wake them. He won't let this go. You know that. Silas never forgives a slight. You've painted a target on your back, and mine. Chris leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes on the flames. His voice was calm, but beneath it ran a current of steel. Then let him come. This cabin's seen storms before. It'll see him through, too. Martha studied him for a long moment, her breath unsteady. There was no boast in his words, no swagger of pride, only a quiet certainty that unsettled her as much as it comforted her. She wanted to protest, to say she was not worth such risk, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she lowered her head, a single tear cutting through the dirt on her cheek. She whispered thank you, though she wasn't sure if she spoke it to Chris, to heaven, or to no one at all. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling against the shutters, carrying with it the scent of snow not far away. In town, gossip would already be stirring. Chris Boone bringing home a chained woman, Silas Crane laughing over whiskey, spinning his version of the tale. Martha could almost hear their voices, cruel and sharp, painting her as shameful, him as foolish. The weight of it pressed down even in the warmth of the fire. But in the steady presence of the rancher, in the safety of her daughter's slumber, she felt something she had not felt in months. A flicker of dignity. A fragile ember of belonging. The night deepened. Chris kept watch by the door, rifle leaning within reach. His eyes stayed on the window, though his thoughts roamed far, toward the reckoning he knew was coming, toward the shadow of Silas Crane sharpening in the distance. He did not welcome violence, but he would not turn from it. Not now. Not with lives pressed into his hands like sacred trust. And in the quiet between the wind and the fire, Martha lifted her head and saw him not as rescuer nor stranger, but as a man whose silence spoke louder than cruelty. Her breath caught, not from fear but from the dawning realization that the chains she had carried longest were not the iron on her wrists, but the shame on her soul. For the first time, she dared to wonder if both could be broken. From beyond the hills, faint and hollow, the echo of hoofbeats rode the night. They drew nearer, deliberate, carrying with them the promise that Silas Crane had not finished his claim. The days that followed were measured not in hours but in breaths, each one carrying the fragile weight of survival and the tentative promise of renewal. Winter pressed its hand more firmly against the valley, frosting the windows of Chris Boone's cabin, bending the branches of pines until they bowed low as supplicants. Inside, the air was warmer, colored by firelight, the scent of wood smoke woven with a faint aroma of bread crisping on the hearthstone. It was a place stitched together by silence and necessity, yet beneath its rough timbers a new kind of life began to stir. Martha Hale sat by the fire, wrapped in Chris's spare quilt, her wrists still marked by the cruel bite of iron. The scars were red and angry, but less so than the bruises fading along her jaw and cheek. Her daughters, Ellen and Ruth, nestled against her knees with a closeness that left little room for air between them. They hovered as though afraid their mother might vanish again if they let her slip from sight. At times she wanted to reassure them, but the truth was she carried the same fear. Every moment of warmth seemed like something borrowed, something Silas Crane would come to collect. Chris moved quietly through the space, the steady rhythm of a man accustomed to chores done alone. He chopped wood outside, boots sinking deep in frost, then carried armfuls inside, laying them by the fire without ceremony. He fetched water from the well, breath steaming with each step, and set the bucket within easy reach. He spoke seldom, but his presence filled the room with an assurance that words could not have matched. It was not the loud protection of a man eager for praise, but the quiet vigilance of one who had chosen his course and would not be moved. Martha studied him in stolen glances, trying to make sense of his silence. A part of her wanted to shrink from his kindness, certain that at any moment he might ask for payment she could not give. Another part longed to lean into it, weary of fighting battles alone. She remembered Silas's words, dripping with mockery, that she would crawl back when hunger gnawed her bones. And yet here she sat, her daughters fed, the fire warm, her chains broken by a man who asked for nothing. The contrast was so stark it bruised her spirit with its unfamiliarity. Ellen, bold in her quiet way, was the first to break the stillness one evening. She tugged gently on Chris's sleeve as he sat sharpening a blade by lantern light. "Sir, do you read books?" she asked, her voice soft but eager. Chris looked down at her, one brow lifting as if the question itself had pulled him from far thoughts. "Not much," he answered after a pause, though his tone carried no dismissal. Ellen's eyes brightened anyway. "Our papa used to. He read to us every Sunday. Mama says words can keep you warm when firewood runs out." Chris's hand stilled on the whetstone. He glanced at Martha, whose face flushed with both pride and sorrow. Her husband had been a schoolteacher before sickness took him, and the memory lived sharp in the girls. Chris nodded once, then rose without a word and crossed to a wooden chest. From its depth he pulled a weathered Bible, the leather worn soft from years of use. He set it in Ellen's lap, her fingers tracing the gilded letters with reverence. Her eyes lit like lanterns. "Would you read for us?" she whispered. Chris hesitated. His voice was not one given to public words, but something in the pleading of her face stirred him. He began with halting cadence, the verses rising slow from his tongue, each syllable heavier than any sermon. The girls leaned close, Ruth's eyes fluttering shut as though the sound itself was a lullaby. Martha watched in silence, her throat tightening. For the first time in years, the room felt whole. The words filled the air not as doctrine, but as comfort. When he closed the book, the girls slept soundly at their mother's side, and Martha met his gaze across the fire. "Thank you," she murmured, though her voice was nearly lost in the crackle of pine. Days folded into one another. Martha regained strength in small increments, first walking to the door, then to the well with Ellen's help, then moving about the kitchen with tentative steps. She kneaded bread with trembling hands, the flour dusting her hair like snow, and the smell of it baking drew the girls to laughter. Chris returned from town one afternoon with cloth for dresses, coarse but sturdy, and boots half a size too big for the children. Martha watched them squeal with delight, twirling in garments not patched with shame, and her eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. But the world beyond the cabin was not silent. In town, whispers grew sharp. Men at the saloon muttered that Boone had taken in a ruined woman, that she was no better than a beggar clinging to him for shelter. Women outside the mercantile shook their heads, whispering that her daughters would bring shame to any household they touched. Chris heard the murmurs when he traded for supplies, but he gave no answer, his silence cutting deeper than any rebuttal. Still, he knew gossip had teeth, and sooner or later it would bite. Martha, too, felt it sting even without hearing it. She carried shame like a second skin, one she could not shed no matter how tenderly Chris treated her. At night, when the girls slept, she sat by the fire and whispered to him, "You don't have to keep us. We'll only bring trouble." His eyes, gray as winter sky, met hers without wavering. "You're here now. Trouble doesn't scare me." The simplicity of his words disarmed her more than eloquence could have. One evening, when the wind rattled the shutters and snow swept across the yard, Chris sat with Martha by the fire. The girls had fallen asleep in their quilts, their breathing soft. Martha's hands, thin but steadier now, folded in her lap. She spoke slowly, haltingly, as if each word cost more than she could spare. Silas told me no one would come. He said I was worthless, that even God turned his face away. She swallowed, eyes fixed on the flames. A part of me believed him. Maybe still does. Chris leaned forward, his voice low. He was wrong. What you endured, it's not weakness. It's proof you're stronger than the men who tried to break you. His gaze did not leave hers, and in that steady look she felt something shift. For the first time, she did not feel defined by the chains or the bruises. She felt seen, as if the pieces she had hidden away were not shameful but sacred. The tears that slid down her cheeks were silent, but they cleansed more than sorrow. The girls stirred, murmuring in sleep, and Martha brushed their hair back with gentle hands. Chris watched the tenderness in her, the fierce love that even cruelty had not extinguished. It stirred something long buried in him, a longing not of desire but of belonging, the quiet ache of a man who had lived too long without a family's warmth. He did not speak it, for words were clumsy in the face of such revelation, but the firelight between them carried it plainly. Outside, the storm howled, snow piling against the door. Inside, the hearth glowed with quiet defiance. For a few hours, the world's cruelty could not breach the walls. Yet in the distance, beyond the pines, Silas Crane was not idle. His laughter echoed in saloons, his threats sharpened over whiskey, his pride wounded by Boone's defiance. He was a man who would not forget humiliation. The chains may have been broken, but the reckoning had only begun. On the third morning after the storm, Ellen burst into the cabin from the yard, cheeks flushed red. "Mama," she cried, breathless. "Men are in town saying Silas is gathering riders. They say he's coming here." Martha froze, her hands clenching the quilt. Chris rose from his chair, his frame filling the doorway as he looked out toward the tree line. Snow still blanketed the earth, but the wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of iron and inevitability. He reached for his rifle, his eyes narrowing. The fire crackled, sparks leaping as if in answer. Martha felt her heart hammer, fear tightening its grip, but beneath it was something else, an ember of trust, fragile yet undeniable. For the first time, she believed she was not alone in facing what came. She looked at Chris, his silhouette hard against the light, and knew that the fight was no longer only hers. And far beyond the pines, as dusk began to fall, the faint glimmer of torchlight appeared on the horizon, weaving through the snow like fire carried on the breath of vengeance. The torches came first, a string of fire weaving down the ridge, wavering against the dark as if the night itself carried anger in its fists. Chris Boone stood at the threshold of his cabin, rifle loose in one hand, his broad frame shadowed by the flicker of the hearth behind him. Snow whispered against the shutters, but it was the drum of hooves that thickened the air, steady and deliberate. Inside, Martha Hale gathered her daughters close, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. She could feel the world closing in, the inevitability of Silas Crane's wrath. Yet beneath her fear lay a strange, stubborn calm. She was not chained this time. She was not alone. Chris watched the line of riders draw nearer, the torches scattering light across snow like veins of fire. He could count at least half a dozen men, their silhouettes hunched and cold, faces hidden beneath broad hats. At their center, sitting proud as a false king, was Silas. His black coat snapped in the wind, his hat brim low, his posture swelling with the smug certainty of a man who had come to collect what he thought was owed. The riders slowed as they reached the yard, hooves sinking deep in the snow. Torches hissed against the frost, shadows stretching long toward the cabin. "Boone," Silas called, his voice carrying oily smoothness even as the wind stole at its edges. "You've made yourself a thief of my property. You've turned my debtor into your housemaid. Now, I'll give you one chance to set her out and send those brats scurrying. Do that, and maybe I'll leave your bones unbroken." Chris did not answer at once. He studied the men, the way they shifted in their saddles, unease swimming beneath their bravado. These were not men driven by loyalty but by coin, and coin could waver in the face of fear. He rested his rifle lightly across his palm, his eyes unblinking. "She's no one's property. She's free." A ripple passed through the riders, some murmuring low. Silas sneered, spittle catching in his beard. "Free? You don't decide that, Boone. The law decides. And I am the law out here." Martha's breath caught, the old terror rising like bile. But when she looked at Chris, she found no tremor in him. His shoulders were steady, his voice low but edged with steel. "Then the law is rotten, and tonight it breaks." Silas snarled, spurring his horse forward a pace, torchlight flaring against his face. He gestured to his men. "Take her. Take them all. And if Boone gets in the way, put him in the dirt." The riders hesitated. None rushed forward. Chris stepped from the doorway into the snow, the cold biting his skin, his breath a pale ghost before him. He leveled the rifle with a calm that unsettled even the bravest of them. "You'll find no easy prize here." The standoff stretched, silence punctured only by the snort of horses and the hiss of torches. Then one man, eager to prove his worth, spurred his mount ahead. The shot cracked the night wide open, rifle thunder echoing against the hills. The man tumbled from his saddle into the snow, torch rolling and sputtering out. The smell of gunpowder hung sharp as iron. Chris did not flinch. His aim never wavered. The other riders cursed, but their hands trembled as they reached for pistols. Martha pulled the girls deeper into the cabin's corner, shielding them with her body. Ruth buried her face in her mother's dress, while Ellen's wide eyes fixed on Chris as if he were carved from stone and fire both. Silas roared, his pride more wounded than his force. "You think you can hold against me? One man against many?" He spurred closer, revolver glinting. But Chris's voice cut across the chaos, low and unyielding. "One man is enough when he's right." Another shot rang, another rider toppling. The rest faltered, doubt seeding like frost in their veins. Silas's fury swelled, his face red with rage. "Cowards!" He spat at them. He pointed his revolver at Chris, but his hand shook with fury more than steadiness. Chris raised his rifle, but in the heartbeat before either could fire, Martha's voice pierced the night. "Enough." It was not loud, yet it struck sharper than the gunfire. She stepped into the doorway, her daughters clinging to her skirt, her body trembling but her eyes fierce. Silas froze, his revolver half raised, as if the sight of her standing unbroken unsettled him more than the weapon in Boone's hands. "You've taken enough from me," she said, her voice gaining strength with every syllable. "You chained me, starved me, tried to strip me of dignity. But you failed. I am not yours. Not now. Not ever." The silence that followed was heavier than snow. Chris's eyes flicked toward her, and in them she saw not warning but pride. She had spoken her truth, and in speaking it had broken a different kind of chain. Silas growled, his finger twitching on the trigger. But before he could act, Chris fired. The rifle's crack split the dark, and Silas's revolver flew from his grasp, the shot shattering wood behind him. His horse reared, nearly throwing him, torchlight casting wild shadows as he fought for control. The remaining riders pulled back, their courage drained, muttering oaths as they turned their horses away. Only Silas remained, panting, furious, his pride bleeding in the snow. He dismounted clumsily, his boots sinking deep. He lunged forward, fist swinging, a brute stripped of power but not of venom. Chris dropped his rifle into the snow and met him head-on. Their bodies collided with a force that rattled the air. Silas's blows were wild, desperate. Chris's were measured, each strike heavy with justice long delayed. Snow sprayed beneath their boots, breath steaming as they grappled. Silas cursed, clawed, spat, but Chris's silence pressed harder than any insult. At last, Chris drove him into the ground, fists raining until the man lay gasping, blood dark against the snow. Chris rose, chest heaving, his shadow long in the torchlight. He did not finish him. He did not need to. Silas's power was gone, scattered with the men who had abandoned him. The once proud Baron lay broken in the dirt, staring up at the sky as though it had betrayed him. Chris turned back to the cabin, his breath ragged. Martha stood in the doorway, her daughters pressed to her sides, eyes glistening in the firelight. He met her gaze, And for the first time since she had been freed, she smiled, not with the fragility of gratitude, but with the quiet strength of a woman who had reclaimed herself. They brought her back inside, the fire roaring against the cold. Chris tended his knuckles, raw from the fight, while Martha wrapped a cloth gently around them. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. She lifted her eyes to him, voice soft. "You didn't just save me. You gave me back my dignity." Chris held her gaze, his voice low, steady. "You had it all along. You just needed someone to see it." The girls, drowsy with exhaustion, curled into quilts before the hearth, their small bodies safe at last. Outside, the snow swallowed the tracks of fleeing men, the torches extinguished one by one until darkness reclaimed the land. The storm passed, leaving the world clean and still. Later, when silence settled deep, Chris and Martha sat side by the fire. She leaned against him, tentative at first, then with the trust of one who had carried her own weight too long. His arm curved around her shoulders, steady as the beams above. They did not speak of promises or futures, for neither needed words. The warmth between them spoke enough. The flames danced high, shadows flickering across the walls. For the first time in years, Martha's heart beat not with fear but with belonging. Ellen and Ruth stirred in their sleep, whispering Mama in dreams that no longer carried sorrow. Chris felt the sound settle in his chest like a bomb, mending cracks he had long ignored. The cabin, once a place of silence and ghosts, breathed with new life. The hearth glowed, not only with fire but with dignity restored. Outside, the snow gleamed beneath the moon, a land cleansed of its darkest night. And in that stillness, as Martha closed her eyes and let her head rest against Chris's shoulder, a truth took root between them. Chains may be forged of iron or shame, but both can be broken by hands willing to lift another soul. Far off, in the distance where the horizon met the pines, a wolf howled into the night. Its cry was not of menace but of witness, carrying the memory of what had been endured, and what had at last been reclaimed.